If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth, well, that's another story. Now, imagine this. A young woman is at a college party, having fun like so many others her age. She doesn't know that her life is about to change forever. The next thing she remembers is waking up in a hospital, hearing words no one ever wants to hear, that she was sexually assaulted. Meanwhile, the accused, a promising Stanford swimmer, is being handcuffed, his once bright future suddenly at risk. This scenario is not a hypothetical. It is exactly what happened in the now infamous Brock Turner case. Turner, a student athlete at Stanford University, was convicted of sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster after a fraternity party. The crime was heinous. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet the sentence, a mere 6 months in county jail, set off a firestorm of public outrage. People across the nation, and even around the globe, ask the same burning question. How could the punishment for such a serious crime be so lenient? The victim's powerful impact statement, read in court and later shared worldwide, became a rallying cry for survivors of sexual assault. It exposed not just the trauma of the crime, but the deep flaws in a system that seemed more concerned with protecting the perpetrator's future than delivering justice for the victim. So, was this a case of justice served, or did the legal system fail? What does this verdict say about privilege and power, and the role of public opinion in shaping justice? Stick with me as we dive into the details of this case and explore why it left so many people questioning not just the sentence, but the system itself. The Brock Turner case became a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about sexual assault, judicial leniency, and the pervasive influence of privilege in the legal system. At the heart of the controversy was Judge Aaron Persky, whose decision to sentence Turner to just 6 months in county jail and 3 years of probation ignited outrage. Persky cited Turner's youth, lack of a prior criminal record, and what he called the severe impact the conviction would have on his future as reasons for the lenient sentence. But to many, this reasoning only underscored systemic inequities, where wealth, race, and status often tip the scales of justice. Adding to the backlash was the victim's searing impact statement, which resonated with millions. Her words, raw and unflinching, painted a vivid picture of the emotional and physical devastation caused by the assault. She addressed not just Turner, but the society that so often blames victims while excusing perpetrators. Her statement quickly went viral, fueling a national conversation about consent and accountability and the failures of the justice system. For critics, the Turner case wasn't just about one crime or one sentence. It was about what it represented. It became a symbol of a legal system that too often prioritizes the futures of perpetrators over the rights of survivors. To his supporters, however, Turner was a young man whose life had been derailed by a moment of poor judgment, and they argued that harsher punishment wouldn't serve justice either. This case also raised broader questions. Should the personal characteristics of a defendant, like their academic or athletic achievements, play a role in sentencing? Can a judge truly remain impartial when societal pressures are at play? And how do we balance the principles of rehabilitation and accountability in cases as sensitive as this one? In this episode, we're going to break down the facts of this case and examine the arguments on both sides, and delve into why it remains one of the most controversial legal decisions in recent history. By the end of this episode, you are going to have the chance to decide for yourself. Was the court's ruling a miscarriage of justice or a reasonable application of the law? When the Brock Turner case first made headlines, it seemed like a straightforward story. The crime was appalling, the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's verdict left little room for doubt. Turner was convicted of 3 felony counts: assault with intent to commit rape of an unconscious woman, sexual penetration of an unconscious person, and sexual penetration of an intoxicated person. Each count carried the possibility of a significant prison sentence, yet the outcome of this case was anything but straightforward. What shocked people most wasn't the conviction, it was the punishment. Judge Aaron Persky sentenced Turner to 6 months in county jail, of which he served just 3 months due to good behavior. And to many, it felt like the punishment did not fit the crime. How could an act so violent, so life-altering for the victim, result in such a light sentence? Was this a case of judicial discretion gone too far? Or was there something deeper at play? Critics were quick to point out that Turner's privileged background likely influenced the outcome. A white, affluent student-athlete at a prestigious university, Turner seemed to represent everything wrong with the way justice can favor the privileged. His status as a Stanford swimmer was mentioned repeatedly during the trial and even in the media coverage, almost as if it were a mitigating factor rather than a detail of his life. Would the outcome have been the same if he hadn't come from a background of opportunity and promise? If he were a person of color, or someone without the resources to mount a strong defense? On the other side, supporters of Turner's sentence argued that he was a man with no prior record, deserving of a chance at rehabilitation rather than long-term incarceration. They claimed that the public outrage was driven by emotions rather than an objective understanding of the law and the principles of sentencing. This case forces us to grapple with difficult questions. Should the public opinion influence legal decisions? Is judicial discretion an essential part of the justice system? Or does it open the door to bias? And most importantly, where is the line between justice and leniency? These questions remain at the heart of the Brock Turner case, and they are why we're diving into this case here in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. The Brock Turner case didn't just spark outrage, it ignited a broader cultural reckoning. At the center of the firestorm was Emily Doe's impact statement, a haunting and deeply personal account of the emotional toll the assault had taken on her. Her words transcended the courtroom, resonating with survivors of sexual assault and their advocates around the world. For many, her statement served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of such crimes, a cost that no sentence, lenient or severe, could truly repay. But Turner's defense team painted a very different picture. They focused on his potential, his bright future as a Stanford athlete, his aspirations, and his youth. Their argument wasn't that he hadn't committed the crime, but that he should be given a chance to rebuild his life. In a controversial move, Turner himself offered a statement that seemed to shift blame onto the culture of drinking and partying on college campuses. This attempt to contextualize his actions only fueled the public's anger, as many saw it as an evasion of personal responsibility. It is personal responsibility, and the college atmosphere is also a factor. Judge Aaron Persky's reasoning for the sentence added another layer to the controversy. He cited Turner's lack of a criminal record, his age, and the potential impact of a longer sentence on his life as justification for the lighter sentence. Persky's decision was legally within his discretion, but it left many questioning whether the scales of justice had tipped too far in favor of the defendant. Couldn't the same arguments, youth and potential and the impact of the crime, be made for the victim? Why did her life seem to weigh less in the balance? The public's response was immediate, and it was intense. Petitions calling for Persky's removal gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Protests erupted across the country, with many demanding accountability, not just for Turner, but for a system they felt had failed survivors everywhere. Social media became a powerful tool in amplifying voices, particularly those of survivors who saw in Emily Doe's story a reflection of their own experiences. At its core, the Brock Turner case isn't just about one crime or one sentence. It's about the larger questions it raises. How do we measure justice in cases of sexual assault? Should a defendant's background and potential factor into sentencing decisions? And what role, if any, should public outrage play in the pursuit of justice? As the public dissected the details of the Brock Turner case, the outrage wasn't limited to the legal system. It also extended to how the media portrayed the crime. Headlines often described Turner as a Stanford swimmer, emphasizing his athletic achievements and his potential, while the victim's identity remained protected under the pseudonym Emily Doe. Many criticized the media for what seemed like an attempt to humanize Turner while reducing the victim to an anonymity. Was this standard reporting? Did this reflect deeper biases about who is deemed sympathetic in the eyes of society? The victim's anonymity didn't stop her voice from becoming a catalyst for change. Her impact statement highlighted the emotional scars that linger long after the physical wounds have healed. Her words were unfiltered and unapologetic, resonating with survivors around the globe who saw their own pain reflected in her story. The statement wasn't just a plea for justice, it was a demand for accountability, not only from Turner, but from a society that often protects perpetrators more than victims. But even as Emily Doe's voice gained momentum, the backlash against Brock Turner became its own controversy. While some saw the public's outrage as a long overdue reckoning, others viewed it as a modern-day witch hunt. Turner's supporters argued that the intense media scrutiny and widespread condemnation were disproportionate to the crime, especially given his age, lack of a prior record. They pointed to the fact that Turner was permanently labeled now as a sex offender, a consequence that would follow him for the rest of his life. This case also raised questions about the role of public opinion in the justice system. Should judges and juries take into account the potential for public outrage when making decisions? Or does that risk turning justice into a popularity contest? This is a tricky question. Critics of Judge Persky's decision argued that he failed to adequately weigh the societal impact of his ruling, while defenders claimed that his role was to interpret the law, not to appease the masses. In the years since the trial, the Brock Turner case has become a flashpoint in conversations about privilege, accountability, and the shortcomings of the legal system. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society values certain individuals over others, and how those values can seep into our institutions, including the courts. As we explore this case further, we're left with one of the most pressing questions of all. Can a legal sentence ever truly capture the gravity of a crime like this? Can laws really fit every crime like this? Or will there always be a gap between justice and judgment? The events of the Brock Turner case unfolded on the night of January 18th in 2015, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. Turner, then a 19-year-old Stanford freshman, was arrested after two graduate students witnessed him assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster outside a fraternity party. Their intervention stopped the attack and Turner fled, only to be tackled and detained until police arrived. This quick response meant that critical evidence, including Turner's DNA and the testimony of eyewitnesses, would play a significant role in his eventual conviction. Fast forward to March of 2016. when Turner was found guilty on 3 felony counts. The case seemed clear-cut, with overwhelming evidence and a conviction secured. Yet when Judge Aaron Persky handed down that controversial 6-month jail sentence in June of 16, it reignited public outrage and became a defining moment in the cultural discourse around sexual violence. The fact that nearly a decade has passed since this case doesn't diminish its relevance. If anything, it underscores how deeply the questions it raised continue to resonate today. The Turner case became a flashpoint for discussions about privilege and accountability, particularly in how the legal system treats individuals based on their background and status and perceived potential. Critics argued that Turner's race, socioeconomic status, and status as a Stanford student-athlete shielded him from the harsher consequences that might have been imposed on somebody else. And on the other side of the debate, Turner's defenders maintained that his life was irreparably damaged by this conviction and the subsequent media firestorm. And some asked, should a single act define a young person's entire future? But for the victim, known only as Emily Doe at the time, the focus was not on Turner's future, it was on the lasting impact of his crime on her own life. Her impact statement spoke to this imbalance, questioning why the court's empathy seemed to extend only to the perpetrator and not to the survivor. This case continues to prompt reflection on the progress made or not made since 2015. How far have we come in addressing systemic bias and prioritizing survivor justice? And how much further do we still have to go? These questions remind us why this case remains a cornerstone in the conversation about justice and privilege and accountability. Let's go back to the night of January 18th in 2015. It was a typical evening for many college students, a night of parties and drinking and socializing on the Stanford University campus. Emily Doe, whose identity was later revealed as Chanel Miller, attended a frat party with her sister. Like many others at the party, she did drink alcohol, unaware that her night would take a devastating turn. Later that evening, Miller became unconscious from alcohol consumption and was found outside by 2 graduate students cycling through the campus. What they stumbled upon was horrifying. A young man, later identified as Brock Turner, was on top of her, sexually assaulting her behind a dumpster. The students immediately intervened, shouting at Turner to stop. When he attempted to flee, one of them chased him down and restrained him until police arrived. Turner was arrested on the spot, and Miller was taken to the hospital, where she underwent an exam and learned about the assault. The case quickly garnered attention due to the circumstances and the involvement of witnesses who physically stopped the crime in progress. Their testimonies would later be pivotal in securing Turner's conviction. From the beginning, the case seemed clear-cut. There were witness accounts, physical evidence, Turner's own admission that he had been drinking heavily that night. However, Turner maintained that the sexual activity was consensual, an argument that would later be challenged by the prosecution with compelling evidence, including Miller's unconscious state during the assault. In March of 16, more than a year after this incident, Turner was found guilty of 3 felony counts: assault with intent to commit rape of an unconscious person, sexual penetration of an unconscious person, and sexual penetration of an intoxicated person. These charges carried a potential sentence of up to 14 years in prison. However, the final sentence decision rested with Judge Aaron Persky, whose ruling would spark a national outcry. When the case went to trial, the evidence against Brock Turner was overwhelming. The graduate students who had witnessed the assault testified about what they saw that night, describing Miller as completely unconscious, unable to consent. Their bravery in stepping forward not only stopped the assault, but also ensured that there would be credible witnesses to corroborate Miller's account. The prosecution presented additional evidence, including photographs and DNA samples, which confirmed Turner's involvement. Turner admitted to engaging in sexual activity with Miller, but claimed it was consensual, an assertion that was directly contradicted by Miller's lack of consciousness and the physical evidence at the scene. The case wasn't just about determining guilt, it was about deciding the severity of the punishment for a crime that had already been proven. Turner's defense team leaned heavily on his background. They painted a picture of a young man with promising future, a Stanford swimmer who had made a grave mistake but was not a threat to society. They submitted letters from family and friends attesting to his character, emphasizing his youth, academic potential, and lack of prior criminal activity or a record of any kind. The goal was clear: secure leniency, avoid a lengthy sentence. Meanwhile, the victim's voice was brought to the forefront through her impact statement. Although Miller remained anonymous during the trial, her words made it very clear how the assault had changed her life forever. She described the humiliation, the loss of control, the deep emotional scars left by Turner's actions. Her statement would later resonate with millions when it was published online, sparking a larger conversation about sexual violence and accountability. By the time the jury returned with its verdict in March of 2016, there was little doubt about Turner's guilt. The court found him guilty on all 3 felony charges. What came next, however, would define the case. Not the conviction, but the sentence handed down by Judge Aaron Persky. In June of 2016, Judge Aaron Persky announced Brock Turner's sentence, and it was far from what many expected. Despite Turner's conviction on 3 felony charges, he was sentenced to 6 months in county jail and 3 years of probation. Persky justified the leniency by citing Turner's age, lack of a prior criminal record, and the significant impact a longer sentence could have on his future. The sentence sparked immediate outrage. Many questioned how a crime of such severity could result in such a light punishment. Advocacy groups and survivors of sexual assault and the general public viewed the sentence as a gross miscarriage of justice, emblematic of a system that prioritizes the futures of perpetrators over the trauma endured by victims. Critics pointed to the glaring disparities in how the legal system treats defendants based on their socioeconomic status and race. Turner, a white, affluent Stanford student, seemed to benefit from a level of leniency that many argued would not have been extended to a person of color or someone without his privileged background. To many, this was not a failure of one judge. This was a failure of the entire system. And this reaction was not limited to the courtroom. Social media platforms exploded with commentary as people from all walks of life shared their outrage and solidarity with Emily Doe. Her impact statement, which had been read aloud during the sentence hearing, was published online and quickly went viral. In it, she addressed not just Turner, but the broader societal norms that enable sexual violence and silence victims. Her words gave voice to countless survivors and became a rallying cry for change. Amid the public uproar, petitions calling for Judge Persky's removal began to circulate, eventually gaining hundreds of thousands of signatures. The sentence also reignited debates about judicial discretion, sentencing guidelines, and the role of public opinion in the legal process. Could the judge have imposed a harsher sentence within the bounds of the law? Or was his decision an appropriate application of judicial principles? As the case gained international attention, it became clear that this was no longer just about Brock Turner or Emily Doe. This was about a system that seemed to favor privilege over justice and left an entire nation questioning its values. The aftermath of the sentencing brought significant and far-reaching consequences. Judge Aaron Persky became a central figure in the public backlash. For many, his decision symbolized a broader pattern of judicial leniency toward privileged defendants, especially in cases of sexual violence. The criticism was so intense that it led to an unprecedented campaign to recall him from his position. And by 2018, voters in Santa Clara County had removed him from the bench. the first California judge to be recalled in over 80 years. Brock Turner, too, faced lifelong consequences beyond that little jail sentence. He was required to register as a sex offender, a designation that would follow him indefinitely and severely restrict where he could live, where he could work. Public outrage didn't subside after his release, and Turner's name became synonymous with privilege and leniency and the failures of the justice system. His family's attempts to defend him in the media only seemed to deepen the public's resentment. And for Chanel Miller, the road to recovery was long and challenging. Though she remained anonymous for years, her impact statement continued to resonate worldwide. When Miller revealed her identity in 2019 with the publication of her memoir, Know My Name, she was met with widespread support and admiration for her bravery. Her story not only highlighted the systemic flaws in the handling of sexual assault cases, but also gave hope to other survivors who felt silenced by shame or fear. This case also catalyzed legal and cultural change. California lawmakers responded to the public outcry by passing legislation that increased mandatory minimum sentences for certain sexual assault crimes. Advocates argued that while these changes were a step in the right direction, they couldn't undo the damage done to Miller or repair the public's trust in the justice system. Nearly a decade after the assault, the Brock Turner case remains a focal point in discussions about privilege and accountability and the treatment of sexual assault survivors. And it forces us to ask, have the changes inspired by this case gone far enough? Or does the system still favor those who have the resources to defend themselves at the expense of victims seeking justice? These questions continue to echo, ensuring that the legacy of this case will not soon be forgotten. Okay, let's get into the prosecution's case. Now, from the beginning, the evidence against Brock Turner was overwhelming. We know this. The testimony of the graduate students who stopped the assault was critical, as they described Miller as completely unconscious and unable to consent. This was supported by physical evidence, including DNA samples and Miller's medical exam, which confirmed the assault. The prosecution emphasized the severity of Turner's actions, arguing that his crime wasn't just an impulsive mistake. This was a calculated act of violence. They pointed to Turner's decision to assault Miller behind a dumpster, away from public view, as evidence that he knew what he was doing was wrong. The prosecution pushed for a prison sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime, citing the lifelong impact on Miller and the need to send a strong message about accountability in cases of sexual violence. But Turner's defense team countered with a very different narrative. They painted him as a young man who made a regrettable mistake while under the influence of alcohol. Their argument hinged on his lack of prior criminal record and his potential for rehabilitation. They also submitted letters from friends and family attesting to Turner's true character, emphasizing his accomplishments as a student athlete and his bright future. The defense's strategy also leaned heavily on shifting blame away from Turner's actions and onto the culture of college parties. They argued that excessive drinking and a lack of clear boundaries led to the events that night. Turner himself claimed that the encounter was consensual, despite Miller being unconscious and unable to respond. This argument, however, faltered under scrutiny, as the physical evidence and witness testimonies painted a very different picture. Judge Aaron Persky appeared sympathetic to the defense's argument, citing Turner's age and lack of a prior record as key reasons for the lenient sentence. Persky also stated that a longer sentence would have a severe impact on Turner's life and his future. For critics, this rationale epitomized the justice system's tendency to prioritize the futures of perpetrators over the trauma experienced by victims. It raised the question, why did Turner's potential seem to outweigh the damage done to Miller? The defense argued that a harsh sentence would ruin a promising young man's life, over a single act of poor judgment. But for the prosecution and much of the public, this framing ignored the real issue, the violent crime committed and the lasting harm inflicted on Miller. The debate became less about the legal facts of the case and more about what the sentence symbolized. The prosecution also highlighted the societal implications of the case. They argued that a lenient sentence would send the wrong message, not just to Turner, but to other potential perpetrators of sexual violence. It would suggest that certain individuals, particularly those with privilege or promising futures, could evade significant consequences for their actions. This, they said, undermined the principles of justice and accountability. For many observers, Turner's defense seemed to rely on the idea that his achievements and potential made him an exception. This raised uncomfortable questions. Should a defendant's background or future aspirations carry so much weight in sentencing? And does this create a double standard where those with privilege are treated more leniently than others? The defense countered by arguing that Turner was already facing severe consequences. They pointed to the lifelong implications of being labeled as a sex offender, which would limit his opportunities for education and employment and housing. His supporters claimed that these penalties, combined with the media firestorm, were sufficient punishment for a young man who had made a mistake. Ultimately, the sentence handed down by Judge Persky reflected this tension between rehabilitation and accountability. For some, it was an appropriate acknowledgement of Turner's potential for reform and his lifelong sentence to being a sex offender. And for others, it was an egregious failure to deliver justice. The Brock Turner case became one of the most polarizing legal battles in recent memory, not because of the conviction, but because of that sentence. Public outcry centered on the stark contrast between Turner's crime and the leniency of his punishment. Many saw the case as a glaring example of how privilege, his status as a white, affluent Stanford athlete, can shape judicial outcomes. Judge Aaron Persky's decision to prioritize Turner's future over the harm caused to Chanel Miller sparked debates far beyond the courtroom. It reignited conversations about systemic bias, the treatment of sexual assault survivors, and the broader cultural attitudes toward accountability. Miller's powerful impact statement amplified this controversy and forced the public to confront the long-lasting damage that is caused by sexual violence. For critics, this case was not just about Turner. This was about the system and how often our survivors left feeling that their pain matters less than a defendant's potential. And what message does this send to others about the consequences of crimes like this? The fallout of this case, including the recall of Judge Persky, ensured that the debate over privilege and justice and accountability would remain in the public eye for years to come. And so now, it is your turn to weigh in. The Brock Turner case leaves us with questions that extend far beyond the courtroom. Was the sentence a failure of justice, or an appropriate decision rooted in the principles of rehabilitation? Did Judge Persky's ruling reflect an inherent bias toward privilege, or was it a balanced application of the law? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, how do we as a society ensure that survivors of sexual assault are heard and respected and supported, while also upholding fairness in the legal process? This case isn't only about Brock Turner or Chanel Miller. It's about the systems and attitudes that shape our understanding of justice. Nearly a decade later, the outrage and debates remain as relevant as ever. Have we made progress in addressing the inequalities exposed by this case? Or are we still grappling with the very same issues? At the end of the day, the court rendered its decision. But what about you? Was justice served, or did the system fail? Let me know what you think. Join the conversation, because cases like this deserve to be discussed and debated and remembered. Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there. Stay curious. Ask the questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.